So many thanks to Ryukoku University, arigatou gozaimasu, and also to Kane-san, for a wonderful translation. In this talk, I want to explore what we could call the Buddhist queer, or Buddhist queers, and how they are traditionally constructed by Buddhist views on non-normative sexualities and gender identities, and how such constructs are framed in traditional Buddhist ethics and teachings on sexualities and gender variance. The concluding exercises in queering then explores the possibilities, tribulations, and opportunities for what we could call queer Buddhist liberation theology. So starting with methodology, I'm working as a religious studies scholar in the intersections of philology, history, anthropology, and what can be called critical theory. And as such, I am approaching the Buddhist traditions and their multiple, divergent, and often contradictory disguises in a rather promiscuous manner, methodologically. The Buddhist queer of my title is more than a shorthand for Buddhist attitudes towards non-normative gender identities and sexualities. And introducing the term theology into Buddhist academic discourse is regularly met with unnecessary suspicion, fortified by, to a degree, tedious pedantry. As a pragmatic shorthand for emic religious academic inquiries and critical reflections, the term theology is, from a global Western perspective, a defendable choice. This is a lecture by a Buddhist scholar cum practitioner who is also has made a name for themselves as a queer theorist and human rights and LGBT rights advocate. As such, my talk journeys on blurred trails, inside out and outside in, from philology and history to anthropology and to a liberation theology of queering or queered Buddhism. So the first striking point we need to keep in mind is that the distinction between biological sex and cultured gender was not made in classical India. Likewise, sexuality in terms of hetero, bi, and homosexuality as a quasi-essentialist human characteristics or normative versus psychopathological or medical categories are inventions of Western 19th century thought. In other words, the shift from behavior, what people do, to identity, what people are, in sexual and gender terms, is a modern superimposition upon non-Western and pre-modern cultures and societies. Secondly, where Western thought displays a basically binary approach to sex/gender, within India or South Asia we find the remarkable emergence of a threefold classification from Vedic times onwards. The third gender, aside of male and female, is conceptualized for what one could term gender, in particularly male deficient people. One Indic term is Pandaka, those who lack normative gender characteristic expressions, usually lack maleness. Pandakas are essentialized gender, usually male, abject identities. They are excluded from the virtuous gender, the male domain. For instance, the influential paracanonical Milinda Panha section records a particular gem of worldly wisdom of the interlocutor King Milinda. So the lusty, the angry, the fool, the fearful, the selfish, the woman, the drunkard, the pandaka, as the ninth, the child. These are the 9 inferior, unstable, unreliable persons. Any secret told to them becomes quickly commonly known. So the list we find in Milinda Panha 93 is clearly judging emotional afflictions in Buddhist terms: desire, anger, stupidity, fear, egotism, It also apparently essentializes addicts, children, women, and pandakas. The text continues to explain that children are seen as not trustworthy due to their moodiness. You see here the Pali terms on the slide. It further gender essentializes women as not trustworthy explicitly due to their essential inferiority, iti itarataya, which you denote the etymologizing alliteration here. As for the pandakas, notably, it is their essentialized ambiguity, anekansikata, which is given as a reason for their lack of trustworthiness. In the Anguttara Nikaya, mixing with pandakas is enumerated as one of 5 circumstances which arouses suspicion against the monk, and the other 4 circumstances being mixing with sex workers, widows, unmarried women, and nuns. Such exclusion lists are also found in some canonical Mahayana Buddhist texts such as the Lotus Sutra. Here, a bodhisattva should not preach the Buddhist teaching or mix with persons who could bring him into disrepute, including rulers and politicians, interestingly, but also widows, young women, and unmarried women. And this includes, again, pandakas. From their description, it is clear that pandakas are seen as completely logical objects of male desire, or, to be contextually more precise, a logical threat to virtuous masculinity, shifting agency of sexual temptation firmly to the external domain of the non-male. However, we do not find any conclusive definition or description of the term pandaka in the early Buddhist sources. Pandakas are seen as a sort of impotent males, be their impotence of a physical, mental, or socially normative nature. This interpretation of pandaka is corroborated by Buddhaghosa's commentary to the Digha Nikaya, where we read the verse Vasoti Puruse Vosoto Pandaka, again a wonderful alliteration, and this comments on the opposition man, Puriso, to Pandaka in the terms of Vasakama and Vosakama, causing virility and causing lack of virility. So a recent suggestion by John Powers that pandaka could be translated as sexual deviant does not fit the term pandaka, since their conditions is seen as congenital or as inflicted. I therefore propose to use the term deficient, mainly male deficient. There are also female pandakas, but mainly male deficient, and that seems to be a more appropriate approximation of translation. South Asian Buddhist commentators of the 4th and 5th century, such as Asanga, Buddhaghosa, and Yashomitra, suggest that the term pandaka covers a variety of non-male or normatively male biological characteristics and gendered or sexual behaviors. A more or less standard list of 5 types of pandakas emerges at this time. It narrows the variety down to forms of physical impotence, autosexuality, and passive intra-gender sexuality. So we have here a group of people whose physical impotence is seen as either complete by birth or cyclical or inflicted as punishment. So this term is a bit problematic, but it is, in my opinion, is clear that it's a punishment and not some form of BDSM. Or those who practice autosexuality motivated by envy, voyeurism, or finally those who do enjoy giving fellatio. So Leonard Swilling has argued that Pandakas are, quote, a socially stigmatized class of passive, probably transvestite homosexuals. That was in 1992, end of quote. However, there is simply no compelling evidence for this conclusion. Swilling's doing of male homosexuality, to adapt a phrase by David Halperin, is clearly anachronistic and does not adequately reflect the complexity of Pandaka as a sex/gender category. The Pandaka is indeed the neither nor category in the classical Indian gender/sex scheme. Buddhist Abhidharma commentaries categorize Pandakas as deprived from both sexes or genders, Ubhaya Lingarahita. Buddhist texts and subsequent Indian medical taxonomies develop a fourfold sex/gender categorization, which adds the intersex category as the both and category, both male and female. The emergence of the fourfold taxonomy is intended to achieve the classical Indian, especially Buddhist, fourfold chatushkoti or logical tetralemma. A male, not male, female, both and intersex, neither nor, Pandaka. However, it should be mentioned that the fourfold view on gender remained also in South Asia a mainly academic one. The male/female binarism has been seen by and large as the norm in the sense of what feminist and queer theories call heteronormativity. Buddhist sources generally construe female sexuality largely as untamed and transgressive, in line with dominant Brahmanical paradigms. All sexual partners of the normative male are generally seen as possessing an especially aggressive and predatory sexualities, and this includes the Pandakas. So the early Buddhist logic for the prohibition of ordination of Pandakas appears then to derive from the cultural view that Pandakas are inherently unable to control their desire. Hence, the following section will investigate the Buddhist queer, so to speak, in the broader context of traditional Buddhist ethics. Early Buddhist ethics discusses gender/sex and sexuality variance almost exclusively in the context of monasticism. The monastic discipline of early Buddhism prescribes celibacy, brahmacharya, for monks and nuns. This celibacy is based on the Buddhist psychology of clinging or attachment. Buddhist sexual ethics are based on the canonical formula of avoiding sexual harm, kamesu michachara, misconduct in sexual matters, the third precept of Buddhist ethical conduct. However, in the early canonical doctrinal text, there is no comprehensive discussion of lay sexual misconduct. What can be gathered from the suttas for lay Buddhist sexual ethics is a rather general rule of sexual non-harming, formulated from the persistent androcentric and heteronormative perspective that sexual harming pertains to violation and or exploitation of the status of the female sexual partner. And this includes her age, marital or renouncer status, so whether she's married, unmarried, or has taken monastic vows, and any possible exploitation of a mental or socio-physical power imbalance. Contextually, in the suttas we also find the condemnation of incest. Broadly speaking, the suttas approach human sexuality as a natural area of human life where suffering should cease. Soteriological discussions of sexuality-related topics concentrate more on the psychology of desire and its connection with the experience of impermanence within samsara. And while the above-mentioned passage from the Lotus Sutra, chapter 13, testifies to a Pandaka excluding Mahayana tradition, The Bodhisattva ethics and the tradition of the influential Brahmana, the Brahmajala Sutra, explicitly affirms the enlightenment potential of sex/gender variance in Rule 40, together with, among others, ghosts. It can be argued that hostile societal norms shine through in both exclusion and inclusion narratives. While in the first case the societal object is affirmed in its marginalized, excluded status, in the contrasting case a philosophical point is made of including even the most unlikely and abject. And while the monastic code prohibits the ordination of intersex and pandakas, it does not particularly stigmatize intra-gender desire and sexual activities above other forms of breaches of celibacy. For lay ethics, there are no early Buddhist sources denouncing intra-gender desire. It is only from the 4th century Common Era onwards that sources evidence the condemnation of intra-gender male-to-male sexual contacts for lay Buddhists. And it is possible, and I've argued that a change in attitudes towards sexuality is prompted by the incurrence of non-Indic influences during the Kushana period. 5th century Common Era singularities, such as Buddhaghosa in his Digha Nikaya commentary, or the rather obscure Saddhamma Smrityupasthana Sutra quoted in Shantideva Shiksha Samuchaya, testify to this changed attitude. But Western scholarship tended to overlook another source that is slightly earlier, about which I will speak now. This slightly earlier source is, of course, the Yogachara Bhumi Shastra, composed in India in the first half of the 4th century Common Era, which explicitly enumerates not only any non-vaginal penetration among sexual wrongdoings, but also more generally any sexual acts with men, other men, and with pandakas. The following East Asian commentarial tradition mainstreams and codifies this interpretation of Buddhist ethical precepts for East Asian Buddhist tradition henceforth. Another source of the 4th century Common Era concerned with elaborating on sexual wrongdoing for lay people is the Abhidhammakosha in its commentary by Vasubandhu, who lists opposite sex, anal and oral sex, as prohibited also for lay people. And although Vasubandhu does not refer to same-sex intercourse, same-sex anal and oral sex seems to be prohibited by analogy. Competing with these emerging traditions of Buddhist sexual ethics are formative texts which exhibit a striking restraint in normative ethical judgments on sexualities and omit the condemnation of intra-gender sexuality at all. For Central Asia, in particular for the Buddhist Uyghur kingdom of Kyoto, such an formative text is the Maitri Simit of the Vaibhashika school provenance. That means it's non-Mahayana. Its most complete manuscript from Hami dates from the 11th century Common Era, but the old Uyghur text itself is translated and adapted from a Tocharian A version of a no longer extant Sanskrit text, whose title can be reconstructed as the Maitreya Samiti Nartaka. This popular text is arguably foundational, or at least highly indicative, for the Central Asian cult of the future Buddha Maitreya, a cult that is archaeologically evidenced from the 5th century Common Era onwards. It is reasonable to tentatively date the Sanskrit or otherwise Indic original to the period 2nd to the 5th century Common Era. The elaborate depiction of hells in chapters 20 to 25 of the Maitri Simit emphasizes mainly monastic property-related sins, sui or yazuk in Old Uyghur. The enumeration of sexual wrongdoings is scant and opposite gender explicit, using the expression to sin, yazin, with female tishi creatures. For monastics only. This appears to be in line with the early Buddhist canonical sparsity in that matter as discussed above. The Maitri Samhita only mentions the breach of celibacy for monastics and incest and disrespect of relational status such as marital infidelity and seduction for lay people. It can be argued that emerging homophobic and transphobic attitudes in Buddhist culture, such as Tibet, while partly reflected and founded in doctrinal and catechetic literature, manifest and unfold largely independently from canonical sources and mirror wider cultural rather than specific religious discourses on gender and sexualities. In terms of gender identity, Buddhism and Buddhist traditions as non-essentialist experiential systems occasionally provide remarkable space for gender fluidity and inclusiveness. Early sources show sex-changing monastics are reaffirmed in their target sex or gender identity. Late Indian Tantric Buddhism even utilizes techniques and symbolism deconstructing and transcending gender binaries. Looking at samsaric messiness, which is something like a chaotic and complex at the same time. In cases of gender fluidity, the first striking finding is the basically non-judgmental and pragmatically approach attributed to the historical Buddha in the context of instances of sex/gender change within the early monastic community. Narratives in the Vinaya demonstrate a spirit of laconic and pragmatic inclusiveness. Here the Buddha accepts the male to female change of a monk by applying the nun's rule to her. Transgenderism and sex change are not questioned as a condition or phenomenon in itself, but accepted as a result of karmic agency, karma, causality or cause and effect as mechanics of conditioned reality within Buddhist philosophy is accepted as sufficient explanation for the phenomenon of sex/gender transposition. The above proposed reading of early monastic code leaves very limited space within contemporary Buddhist discourses to argue for the exclusion from ordination of LGBT people per se. In fact, the hermeneutics employed above serve as an example for nascent Buddhist liberation theology. Still, the call for these measures has been and is being made by, for instance, conservative influential Thai Buddhist communities. The Thai Buddhist lay communities generally tolerate rather than include Katuis, the specifically Thai trans identity or community. And recently, bits of Katuis for ordination were ultimately rejected by mainstream Thai state Buddhism. So we arrive on this final section on queer Buddhist liberation theology. So the debate around queer inclusion within traditional Buddhist spaces challenges Buddhist traditions and organizations locally, nationally, transnationally, and globally. Such troubling of Buddhist status quo, queering of Buddhism, are examples how scholarship also can fertilize internal debates, while internal debates echo back to the researchers who can then decide to employ their own method mix, crossing from history to anthropology, repositioning, and if necessary, blurring inside and outsider roles. Buddhist modernist scholars and practitioners alike view the gender inequality or equality paradox between soteriology and sociology as contextually produced within the societal attitudes and value systems of classical ancient India from around the 6th century before Common Era to the 5th century Common Era. Reclaiming gender equality and fighting for women's rights, for instance, has become a major issue for Buddhist modernisms in the form of feminism, Buddhist feminism, and as a so-called action dharma, a vital part of contemporary socially engaged Buddhism. Through feminism, in the context of Buddhist modernism, a space is created for queer Buddhist liberation theology. In similar ways to Buddhist feminism, the queering impulse easily expands this action dharma to reach LGBT and trans and intersex inclusion and equality. As a Buddhist activist myself, I have blurred the scholarly insider-outsider roles often when speaking out for LGBT inclusivity within Buddhist communities both in Asia and in the global north. Reflecting on my own academic activist preaching, the following case might serve as an example for this modernist queer liberation Buddhist critical thought. For instance, here in 2013 at an invited public lecture on Buddhism and sexuality at Patan Archaeological Museum, I addressed an audience of students, scholars, and great number of Buddhist Nevari elite, as well as some Nepali LGBT activists. In form of concluding, I choose to challenge the audience and in an appeal for Buddhist queer liberation. In global contexts, LGBTIQ+ subjects can engage Buddhist philosophy and practices for emancipatory queering, or for heteropatriarchy reaffirming dequeering, as Engleich's study of American Buddhists shows. It is clear that any Buddhist queer liberation theology encounters opposition not only in traditional Buddhist segments. My own experience within the Tibetan Karma Kagyu convert movement shows also in those forms of Buddhism which largely benefit from and align itself with Buddhist modernism. Both as a Buddhist teacher and as an academic, I have challenged and critiqued the leader of the neo-orthodox Diamond Way movement, Ole Nydal, about his sexism and homophobia. In consequence, I was unceremoniously removed from internal Diamond Way information systems and banned from teachings in Diamond Way centers. With this, any moderating academic or practitioner influence I held within this particular branch of the Karma Kagyu tradition had been eradicated and the queer blossoming queer liberation silenced. The movement further moved along the way towards what now has to be described a closed personality cult. The queer failure in this case aside, Buddhist critical constructive thought in the form of queer Buddhist liberation theology forms an exciting opportunity for the meeting of post-structuralist critical theory, queer theory, and Buddhist theology or Dhammology of enlightenment. At the core of queer theory lies the observation that all intersecting facets of identity, including gender, sex, ethnicity, culture, and so on, are performative rather than ontological. This means that identitarian reality is in a state of constant processuality and fluidity. Similarly, Buddhist philosophy maintains that the experience of reality in the conditioned state in Saṃsāra is shaped by wrongly identifying with disturbing emotions and the grasping of an ego delusion. Ultimately, there is no self, no permanent essence, just causality and the continuity of the constant ever-changing stream of karmic basic components, dharmas. All experience and performances of empirical personhood are ultimately illusionary, dreamlike, and veil-like in comparison to the transpersonal experience of non-conditionality, enlightenment beyond identitarian boundaries. For sex/gender in its performance, this means enlightenment beyond restricting binaries. Just as queer theory aims to liberate from the bonds of normative expressions of gender and sexualities, Buddhism aims to liberate from the limitations of any identitarian experience within a clearly pragmatic framework of altruistic motivation in which empathetic compassion is crucial. For Buddhists, this transformative process is ongoing and as long as conditioned reality is experienced. Accepting the open mesh, to use Sedgwick's phrase, that are human possibilities of gender and sexualities, and celebrating non-categorizing and non-normatizing inclusiveness as queer theory propagates, conforms with the Buddhist methods of cutting through the ego illusion on the level of the heaps of graspings, categorization, and judgmental impulses. Embodying queer means embodying queer means embodying the identitarian messiness and biographical idiosyncrasies of human existences, including ethnic, cultural, socioeconomic, and physical mental variability. In consequence, we need intersectional theory or intersectional queer feminist approaches to embodied human performativity. What Buddhism then can bring to queer theory might be that strong altruistic motivation and a constructive, maybe utopian vision that challenging and deconstructing normativities does not result in a socio-ethical vacuum and a postmodern behavioral arbitrariness and cultural relativism. While the queering impulse struggles sometimes to assert itself within the complexities of Buddhism's post-queer ethics centered on the absence of suffering, physical integrity, and on compassion, could find a solid foundation in Buddhist thought.